And her answer was perfect. Until I see myself in the mirror, she said, I'm still 17. It helps to remember that everyone in this room is still 17, at least part of the day. For some, it's the high point of your life, and you've wondered why it's all been downhill. And for some, it's a low point from which you can never quite escape. And for whatever reason, it's always there. As I look back, the only success I've ever had in this preacherly life comes from touching that part we all have that's a Seymour or an Orrin or an Audrey. May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my redeemer. And now you're asking, what do Seymour and Audrey have to do with Easter, to say nothing of Little Shop of Horrors? Well, it is actually a tale of evil. It comes in through the cracks, of course. I spent this Lent looking at sin and evil for liberals because we are, I think, with some justification, mocked as being rather naive. If we only just try a little harder, things will be okay. So I decided to take evil seriously, and sin too, and looked at it. Is it real, this sin stuff? What makes it so bad? Why do we do it, and why do we do it when we know it's wrong? And all through Lent, I preached on one aspect or another. And we also heard songs from the musical, some of which were a little bit challenging. I wasn't here for Feed Me when the plant literally demands blood. I was here when Orrin Scrivello, DDS, and his sadistic dentistry were on display. And you were beginning to think, what in the blazes is going on around here? I remind you who were here 8 years ago, I told you then, one of my jobs is to mess with your head. Well, if you don't know, the show, the movie, the show that preceded the movie, and the movie that preceded the show, Back to Roger Corman, is about a strange plant that Seymour Krelborn discovers that begins to bring him good luck. And he works there in a little florist shop in the worst part of town, Skid Row. He pines for Audrey, who is the subservient girlfriend of this sadistic dentist, Orrin Scrivello. And Orrin Scrivello is a very bad person, but we learn slowly that Seymour Krelborn is bad too, but not because he wants to be. See, the plant brings him good luck. Suddenly he's getting successful. Suddenly things are happening, and it's the plant that's drawing those things into his orbit, and he learns, Seymour does, that if he just feeds it a little blood, a little more blood, eventually whole human beings, he can have the whole world. And it's in the middle of that Seymour finds the nerve to dispatch Orrin Scrivello, DDS, feeding both the plant and removing a rival. And then he finds the nerve to come to Audrey's defense, and they sing that wonderful show-stopping tune. And I've always loved the name, Suddenly Seymour, because we all have an inner Seymour that's never going to be a success. You got to be named Chuck, Jim, Biff, something manly, and Seymour is not a manly name. And for all of you men who never felt manly, that would be all of you. Your inner Seymour rose to the occasion, didn't you? I love that song. Still don't see the connection to Easter, do you? Hang on, we're going to get there. As you could probably tell from the reading and from my title, that I'm gesturing toward actually another story this morning, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a very serious book by Milan Kundera, a Czech author. And I wanted to get to the title because his whole book is about this question of weightiness and lightness. His point is that perhaps life is ephemeral and even meaningless, and when you think about that, it makes life unbearable, the unbearable lightness of being, that it's really trivial. It just goes by like that. It doesn't mean anything. He also, Kundera thinks, that those who want life to be meaningful and weighty try to make it that way. They burden themselves. and they try vainly to find or create meaning in this purposeless life. In other words, the musical comedy tells us to be hopeful, and the literary novel tells us to despair. Two different stories. And in the middle of those stories is that story that brings us to church on Sunday, on this Sunday, the gospel itself, which is another story. Have you ever noticed when you read the Passion parts from Palm Sunday to Easter that nothing happens on Saturday? Stuff happens Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's jam-packed with stuff. Nothing happens on Saturday. Easy to explain. It was the Sabbath. Nobody did anything. But I can't help but wonder if all of the followers of Jesus, his disciples particularly, did not at that moment feel exactly as Milan Kundera was talking, a sense that life was meaningless. They had given years following this promising leader. And in the space of a week, 3 years was erased. On Saturday, their leader was dead of an awful execution used for criminals. He was mocked and abused. Everything he stood for was obliterated in the space of 24 hours, like the Prague Spring in which Milan Kundera's novel takes place. The great momentous beginning that started right there on Palm Sunday was worthless on Saturday. If you were one of Jesus' disciples, you did not have a worse day than Saturday. And then the story says a miracle happened. You all know it. What seemed to be a defeat was now a victory. What seemed to be a loss was now a gain. What seemed to be meaningless was now the most meaningful moment in history. And it makes no sense at all. Not an ounce. And I don't mean just the rabbit out of a hat ending, which makes us all think, what? The whole story was wonderful and literary and poignant and tragic. It was a great story right up to that moment, and poof, he comes out of the grave and ruins the tragic ending. Think about it. Up until Easter, it's a tale of idealism to the point of death, of courage when facing defeat, of speaking truth to power, the kind of thing that inspires us to soldier on through life, even when we don't know how it's going to turn out. This Jesus dude is serious stuff. I want to follow in that guy's footsteps because that's my life. And then he jumps up out of the grave and said, well, there we go. That's not going to be me. I'm making light of this because it is a bizarre story on the face of it. Instead of an inspiring historical tale, we get this elaborate fantasy, as far-fetched in some ways as thinking of Zeus up there throwing thunderbolts. Or a story, for that matter, of man-eating plants, narrated by a Greek chorus of doo-wop singers. It makes about as much sense as a man stuck in Troy, taking 20 years to get home to Ithaca. In other words, this story makes no sense, but no story makes sense because it's a story. In fact, the more outlandish the story, the more we love them. Yeah, I know myths can be explained as how primitive people explain things. Okay, but then explain to me 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It didn't happen. It can't happen. And yet we read it and we find meaning in it. How many of you have read Harry Potter books? How many of you think there really are wizards? Good luck with that. But you still love the story because it says something about the world that reality doesn't. Our favorite stories are outlandish. They're preposterous stories. I'm reading a very difficult book by a scholar. I think it's defined, it's required. If you're going to be a scholar, your writing must be impenetrable. Immanuel Kant is responsible for that, by the way. We will kill him again if we need to. Brian Boyd, who's a professor, in Auckland, New Zealand, wrote a book called The Origin of Stories, in which he says our love of stories, fictional stories, outlandish stories, is an evolutionary adaptation because it's the way we allow our brains to imagine the world that's coming, imagine different ways in which we can be, and that equips us to respond to the world in all its complexity. We love stories because they allow us to grow and imagine and be better adapted to the world. And of course, you don't have to believe him, but find me a culture without an outlandish story in the middle of it. George Washington hurling coins across the Rappahannock. Abraham Lincoln splitting rails with one hand with one whack of his axe. That's preposterous too. We love preposterous and outlandish stories. They take us away from reality, far away. And then when we come back to reality, we see it a little different, don't we? You've all had this experience in real life. So you're away off on vacation for a couple of weeks. You're away from the house. As you come back to your home, it doesn't look exactly the same, does it? You go in the door and you smell, and it smells different. You see, when you go away from reality for a while, maybe in a fantasy world, you come back and you see reality differently. You see it anew. You see it afresh. You see it in ways you have not seen it, felt it, tasted it, smelled it before. You're more alert. You're more present. You go away in fantasy. You come back to reality. The two of them make you a better person.